Okay, this is David Zierler, Director of the Caltech Heritage Project. It's Tuesday, May 3rd, 2022. I'm delighted to be here with Professor Douglas R. Schmitt. Doug, it's great to be with you. Thank you for joining me today.
Oh, thanks, David. Yeah.
Doug, to start, would you please tell me your title and institutional affiliation?
Okay. Right now, I'm the Brand Professor of Unconventional Energy at Purdue University. But I'm actually here only since 2018. Before that, I actually was at University of Alberta as a professor and Canada Research Chair for 29 years. So, yeah.
Doug, who is Stephen and Karen Brand, and is there any particular connection with your research?
Uh, yeah, he was a PhD geology graduate from Purdue, and he went into the petroleum industry and did quite well. And he wanted to. He's there in Houston, and I met them, and so he's a geologist. He just wanted there to be more of a geology geophysics input to a lot of the modern things that are going on with energy developments. Then a lot of it's engineering driven, and I think that was his prime motivation. That really there should be geology, geophysics type people more involved too. So.
Doug, I can't help but ask, but the term unconventional in your title, unconventional resources, unconventional energy, what does that connote as it relates to what you do?
I connote it to mean different things. Some people would make that mean hydraulic fracturing in shales, right, for gas production. And but I also do. So I've been involved with understanding rock properties with that, and forces in the earth and induced seismicity, for example. But I'm also very interested in other aspects, say related to sequestration of carbon, and coming is sequestration of hydrogen, because we need to store hydrogen for if we move a lot of our processes that way underground, and also geothermal. So I've been involved with all of those kinds of aspects. Yeah.
Doug, there's geophysics, there's seismology, there's mineral physics, earth material physics, so many different subfields. At the end of the day, what's the best way to describe what you do?
Okay, today I'm a little bit of an odd duck, right? So I would describe myself as a rock physicist, but a rock physicist who, I do both lab work and field work, right? Because I see the Earth as as something we can that's what we're measuring, right? Trying to understand the physical properties in the Earth, and so but at the core of what I do, and it comes from my time at Caltech. Actually, as a mineral physicist, I've grown away from that, but it's really understanding rock properties in the earth and how they're affected by different things, whether I'm doing it in the field or whether I'm doing it in my lab. So,
Doug, is your research more on the observational experimental side or the theoretical side?
yeah, no, I'm pretty much, I'm not smart enough to be, or I'm not patient enough. I'm not, I think, right? Yeah, you have to be a special person to be a theoretician. So I'm really more of a observational type of person, right?
Are there theories that provide guideposts to your experimental and observational
Oh, of
work?
course. And part of my work has actually been trying to test some of those theories, which need to be tested, in my view. For example, how seismic waves reflect off of different kinds of interfaces in the Earth. And so in my lab, we develop ways to actually fundamentally test some of those kinds of, theories have been around for a long time, and but nobody ever tested them, right? And we took a lot on faith. So things like that. But running the gamut through to studying, take this piece of rock and how would that behave under the pressure and temperature if I stick CO2 into it, and what would its seismic waves be, right? So there's quite a gamut within my lab there.
Doug,
Yeah.
for you, when is it important to do field work, to go out yourself, and when is it sufficient to have data remotely coming to you?
Uh, guess I've never really had data remotely coming to me. So I've been involved actually in starting from my PhD work, part of my PhD work at Caltech was on measuring forces in the earth from boreholes. It was kind of a bizarre project, but that got me into scientific drilling also in a big way. And I've been involved with, probably upwards of 15 or more scientific drilling projects globally on a variety of different topics, right? Yeah, we go out, we're on the rig, we collect the data, or we also collect active source where we have our own vibrator truck, right? And we'll collect seismic data over certain kinds of features in the earth, right? Like right now, we're doing a lot with impact structures, for example, and trying to understand their structure and the velocities within them and what that means for damage and how craters are created, issues like that. So no, I'm very rarely do I get data from someone else. Usually I'm the guy who likes to go out and get it. Yeah, maybe I'm crazy, but that's not the way a lot of the science has gone, I realize, but yeah.
Doug, what interface do you have with industry, either from utilizing some of their tools or on the flip side, them taking an interest in what you're doing and applying that for commercial purpose?
Right. Yeah. So that would be, yeah. Of course, I use similar tools to what industry would use, right? Particularly, say, seismic reflection profiling, but say a lot what's in my lab is actually quite unique. In the past, companies or projects that were industrially related would say, send me earth materials, right? And we'd try and characterize them as much as we could, and then basically abuse them in the lab. We subject them to pressure and temperature and pulse them and measure how much they squeeze up, things like that. And that has applications to understanding at scales that I can't deal with, say what they deal with in industry, very, very large scales, right? Just orders of magnitude, what kind of data they can collect, right? It's almost impossible for a professor to deal with that today. But that allows them to then interpret their data more fully, right? Like if you're looking for the growth of you injecting carbon dioxide into the ground and you want to know where it goes, right? And so the work that we've done in the past would help you interpret those seismic results to say, okay, it's here and maybe the pressure is that and there's so much CO2 there and things like that, right? So that would be one example. Yeah.
Doug, with all of the talk about sustainability in the field, you mentioned carbon sequestration. Does that affect the kind of research you do, the kind of research you're able to do, or is that really just a buzzword?
No, it's something that's going to be happening probably at an increasingly large scale. It's stopgap, right? We can't cut the fossil fuels overnight, and we're never going to be completely able to do that. There are certain things that we still will need, but we can't release so much CO2 either, right? Or greenhouse gases in general. So the stopgap, for the next few decades will probably be just putting it underground, right? And it's going to require a huge amount of effort, a huge amount of resources, and it's going to provide maybe 15% of the solution, right? But no, it's happening. It's going to be happening at an increasing scale, just because of the pressure to reduce CO2, particularly say for industry, right? And coal-fired power plants are probably they don't make money anymore. So, but things like that are producing a lot of CO2, making cement, making steel. Right, it needs to be. We need to do something with that, right? And so, for the time being, this getting rid of the CO2 is probably going to be a fairly important part of CO2, to reduce the amount that actually gets released. And to me, I mean, it's actually pretty interesting scientifically, right? You take something that's somewhat chemically reactive, has unique physical properties itself, and you put it into the ground, and what happens, right? I mean, it runs the gamut from producing earthquakes to how does it over, say, 100 years or 1,000 years become rock itself. So there's just a wide variety of really interesting kinds of issues with that. And if we go to hydrogen, I think that's even going to be more intensified because hydrogen's even more reactive and more and biologically active in things, right? So both those two things will be ramping up in this decade, I think.
Doug, I'm curious what some of the seismic monitoring techniques you learned at Caltech have stayed with you throughout your career.
Actually, I didn't do seismic. I worked with Tom Ahrens, and so I did. I don't know. You probably talked to other people who worked with Tom Ahrens. He had these cannons, right? And we fired things at minerals, put them under very high pressure and temperature. So that was half my thesis. But the other half was actually working on trying to measure forces in the earth, stress in the earth. And that kind of is the launching pad that, I went down more into rock properties, drilling. So I didn't really do any I took courses on seismology at Caltech. And then, but a lot of what I've done in the applied seismology, I did work before I came to Caltech in industry as a geophysicist. So I had some background that way. And then I, developed a lot of what I've learned since when I was an assistant professor and continuing, right? You never end. Yeah. So I think what Caltech did give me was, a good, the good theoretical background and to have that and some of those skills. Although, like I said, I'm not the best theoretician. But just a good grounding, right? Yeah. To move from.
Doug, what about optical interferometry? Was that something that you did at Caltech?
Yeah, you really looked that up. Yeah, no, it was, and that was the stress measurement, right? And it was kind of a bizarre project, and where we would actually, at the time, I guess I'm old now, but you've probably seen the real old, the holograms with laser light in 3 dimensions, right? So we developed that technique. We didn't develop the technique, we applied the technique to measure tiny deformations on a borehole wall, and those tiny deformations would tell us what the force in the earth was. And once we knew that, then we could understand the stresses in the earth, right? And that had, I was really involved with that, and I continued that and developed actually some other techniques that came from it was more in the engineering literature, but that continued kind of that trying to measure tiny deformations of things using optical methods, right? So, and those techniques still exist today. And they said, and that was the project that kind of got me down the road that I am now, right? Into my postdoc and from there. So,
Doug, for your research group at Purdue, what are the kinds of careers that your students go into?
The Alberta one, let me back up because I had a lot of students. So I've had about 20 PhDs and maybe 45 masters. And so most of those people, Alberta was a good place to be because we had a very strong, very quantitative geophysics group, right? And but most of the people went to industry, right? And so I should have 300 papers, but they start working before they're finished, most of them, and and some went into academia, of course, right? Globally, one of them just became the chief geophysicist of Saudi Aramco, for example, right? So they've all done very well, right? At Purdue here, so I'm just rebuilding. It's like starting again, coming to a new country, right? And so just rebuilding the group. So I have 3 grad students, and I think one will probably go to industry, right? And one for sure should be a professor, but she wants to go to Google, even though, because it pays so much right now. Very brilliant woman. And then the master's student, I'm hoping he stays as a PhD, and he wants to do planetary, so I'm sure that he'll be academic. But here, it'd be more academic at Purdue than it would have been at Alberta. So I've had students doing, quite a mix of different kinds of things, and in different industries too. So as you probably know, right, your sciences have had a bit of a problem the last 5 years or so, at least in industry. But the good thing is that my students were able to find jobs in machine learning and take it elsewhere, right? So I'm happy I gave them the right background, so that they could do those kind of alternate things. So,
Doug, just as a snapshot in time, what are you currently working on?
oh, I'm not good at saying no, right? So right now, one student is working on a deep borehole in Alberta, the analysis of the stresses and the forces in the earth there. Another student is working on borehole data that I collected, and with my colleagues, of course, on the Alpine Fault, to understand the Alpine Fault in New Zealand, its structure. And another student is working currently on, there's a meteor impact crater very conveniently nearby, 30 miles away. And so we collected seismic data over that, and he's working away at for his master's. And recently I had two PhDs finish. One did his PhD on seismic work and rock properties associated with the Chicxulub impact, right? With that killed the dinosaurs. I was on that drilling project. And the other one was working at forces in the earth related to induced earthquakes, right? Where we were able to understand the forces in the earth better and try and determine what caused those earthquakes. So yeah, I do too many different kinds of things, I think, but yeah.
Well, Doug, let's now go back. Prior to your time at Caltech, tell me about your education at the University of Lethbridge. Were you specifically focused on geophysics and seismology even then?
No. It was a great time to be at the University of Lethbridge. It was only 1,500 students. It was a brand new university, almost, maybe less than a decade old. And the thing is, when you're in a small university like that, I was TAing by third year, right? And you got to know the professors very well. There was no geophysics set. It was too small a school, but there was physics, and so I took a physics degree. And so that got me, a good background in physics, and I wanted to continue in physics. And then what happened was, literally, I was walking down the hall at the University of Lethbridge before I graduated, and my former TA says, "Hey, Doug, you want a job?" And I said, "Okay." Because I hadn't really planned out what I should be doing as well as I should. And I got up, I got an interview, and I got a job as a geophysicist, right, in 1980. And if you recall, well, yeah, that was the time when the energy prices were high. There were shortages, we were coming off of Iran, issues like that, right? And so things were booming. And that got me into geophysics, and then I went to grad school and kind of shifted, with the mineral physics and the borehole stuff with Dr. Ahrens, and moved from there. But yeah, I'm glad because I love geophysics, right? It's such a I probably would have been doing some kind of collider physics or something, right? You never know, right? But I'm happy I ended up in geophysics because it's just, you can bring in so many different kinds of aspects, and it's really good broad science, right? So,
Doug, tell me about your time in industry and if that was useful in focusing your interest once you got to Caltech.
Yeah, it was. I mean, that's what got me into geophysics, right? And that's why I applied to geophysics for graduate school. And it was at a company called Texaco, which is mostly gone now. But he worked in a geophysics group and interpreting seismic data. I didn't know what I was doing, right? But at the beginning, but I learned. And it was a different time because I actually, there were no computers, right? Everything I was actually had maps, and I colored on the maps and things like that. But that got me into geophysics, and I was able to play on the computers there a little bit. And and start my learning, right? And it was a great place to learn. It was a very supportive environment, right? Where you had the senior geophysicists helping the younger geophysicists. And they were very good to me when I said I wanted to go to grad school. They actually helped support me a little bit. And then we parted ways very amicably when I said I want to do a PhD, right? So yeah, no, it was different times. I don't think things like that would happen today, right? So,
Doug, being in industry and out of school for a few years, what mentors, if any, did you rely on in terms of thinking about where you should apply for grad school?
I don't know. I was taking some courses at the University of Calgary, and there was a young professor there. But I have to admit, I was pretty naive. So I applied to a lot of different places, and I'm not sure why I applied to Caltech. To be frank, it was probably because my aunt lived in the valley to some degree, right? And I wanted to get away and get a broader view, right? I mean, so I applied to Canadian schools and some U.S. schools, and then I think that's it might have been why I came to Caltech was I had my aunt close by, so but it was a good choice, right? Anyways, yeah. I have to admit, I was from a small community in southern Alberta, and I didn't know anything about the academic game at all. I'm still pretty naive, right? Some people seem to know about all this academic game, right? They're born into it, but I wasn't, right? So
Yeah, it seems like you did okay.
it seemed like I kind of fell through.
Doug, what were your impressions when you first arrived in Pasadena?
I was scared, I mean, it was just okay. I'm going to tell you a funny story.
Please.
So I get to Caltech, and this was that first few months I'm there, and there's this very distinguished looking fellow walking around with white hair and shorts and looking, official, right? And then I thought, oh, this must be, all these famous professors. This must be some famous professor. And then a few months later, I see him, and he's down digging in the flower bed. It turned out to be one of the gardeners, right? So it was just, actually, it's a great story because, no, I mean, probably a fantastic person, right? But how he bore himself and everything, I just thought he was a professor.
That's great.
But no, it was overwhelming. Like I said, times have changed a lot, right, in the world. And, I came from a fairly isolated area, rural area, right? And I was thrown in with my friends now, that they were from all over, like, Luciana from Mexico and Ronan from France and so on and so forth. And these different mix of American accents, so it was actually, yeah, it was a little bit overwhelming a bit at first, right? But no, scary.
What was the process for determining who would be your thesis advisor?
Okay, you probably heard about, and it's not as strong as it was when we were there, but there was at that time, and I don't know what they do now, but at that time, you'd come in, and basically there'd be our cohort, right, of graduate students, say in geophysics, and we'd be put in, rooms. Well, actually, we were all kind of put in one room to begin with, because they were short of space. But you then started taking courses. Nobody really assigned you a professor, right? I think today it's much more, maybe not at Caltech, but I know other places you almost know who you're going to work with before you arrive, right? Because funding has to be in place in that. But this was one of the beauties of the place. We had to do these, we had to do 3 projects. Each of them had to be a different topic. And then and I'm forgetting the name of the projects, I shouldn't. But then after 1 year, we would present those. And that would basically be our examination, whether we should continue to be in the PhD. But during the process of those 3 projects, right, you worked with 3 different professors, and you got to see a potential project that you might like. and continue with it, right? And so I actually did two with Aaron's because Aaron seemed to grab on to me, I think, for some reason, and another one with Rob Clayton that I wished I'd continued on because other people did similar things about a decade later and got it published all over the place. But no, I did that, and then that it seemed to be that through these projects, I think was a way that you got to see what you wanted to work on and who you might want to work with. So, and then I ended up working with Aaron. So I think the experimental aspects, like me, and also he was quite an insistent person. So, right. And no, so that's basically, I didn't go there saying I want to do this with that person, right? It was more, and again, it was back to my naivety of not knowing what I was doing, right?
Doug, once you got the lay of the land, what was your sense in the early 1980s? What were the big debates in geophysics and seismology? What was happening at the Seismo lab that people were excited about at that point?
Okay, well, there was a lot of the mineral physics community, for example, was quite small at that point in history, just from that perspective. And so some of the things that were happening around that time were finding new high pressure mineral phases, and particularly one called perovskite that not at Caltech, but at other places people had found. So just I think that was just the growth in trying to understand what might be deep in the earth was one big thing. There was a lot of people, shorter term things. People would, there'd be an earthquake and everyone would run out and study that earthquake for a while. And then some of the early tomography work of the Earth, right? So I know where people would take the arrival times. I'm sure others have talked about this, but take the arrival times and back calculate for what the deep structure of the Earth would be in detail, right? And starting to see major structures, say within the mantle, related to subduction and upwelling parts of the mantle, could start to appear. And of course, those have been refined continuously since, right? Those kind of models, right? So I think those were probably the things that stuck out to me the most, right?
And what was Aaron specifically working on at that point?
Oh, he had a large group. He was working on quite a few things. So he was, one aspect was trying to measure the temperatures of minerals that would be temperature, volume, pressure relationships of different kinds of minerals, trying to understand that, right? So that we could understand better what, say, seismic velocities might be in the Earth, right? So, there was a lot of that kind of work going on, but he was advancing things on measuring temperatures, for example. And so some of the work I did was measuring the temperature of shock quartz, which would be pressures that weren't that deep, maybe 300 kilometers compared to what some of the other work is. Another big project was measuring the temperature of molten iron, for example, that Sally Rigdon, one of my fellow students in the lab, worked on, right? And those are numbers that help constrain. These are still things that are not that well known, but help constrain, say, what the outside of the core, the inner core of the Earth might be. Not the inner core, the outer core, the molten part of the core might be, right? So it kind of important experiments that way. He was also involved in looking at impact structures and related to Chicxulub, right? So him and one of his colleagues, they did some of the first numerical models of impact structures to see what happens when something big comes in, what gets thrown out into the atmosphere, how do shock waves propagate away. And that was early numerical modeling, which has become quite a subfield now. And then this stress project that I worked on. So that was, that probably wasn't really as mainstream, but I think he had an idea and he got the money to pursue it. And so, yeah.
Doug, what computers were in use at the Seismo lab at that point?
Okay, I can't remember the names, but they'd be nothing compared to what we have today. Rob Clayton, there was a mainframe, an old style mainframe right, that was still there, where you had tapes and everything, right? You had to learn how to mount the tapes. And then I think Rob Clayton got a new computer and I should have forgot the names of these things, right? But with Unix-based systems were coming in, right? So I had to learn Unix and C++ with Rob, and then some of the first kinds of workstations. I remember maybe about 2 or 3 years when I was a grad student, Rob Clayton or someone else would have gotten a workstation, and it had a color screen, and you could make images on it. And I think that was one of my a good friend. Now, right? He spent 6 months because no one knew this, right? Just trying to figure out color maps. Things we take for granted today, right? How to make a color map so if you have an image of something, what that would look like, right? On that workstation, yeah. So color screens, actually, yeah. And then towards the end of the Cheryl and I were actually house mother and parents at Page House. And so we had access to what I'd call luggable, like 40-pound laptop, computers with a little screen like that. And both Cheryl and I wrote our PhDs on one of these things, IBM kind of thing. And then we, of course, printed it on the main computer at the lab. So that was coming in, right? I remember the little Apples and those kind of, the PC kind of computers were towards the end of my grad school starting to ramp up much more rapidly there. Yeah.
Doug, in developing your thesis, how much of it was Aaron's giving you a problem to work on, and how much it was you coming up with the idea yourself?
Actually, well, he came up, say, with the stress measurement, the main idea, and another PhD student had worked on it, and then I continued it. And then the shockwave things, I mean, he got me going, but what Aaron's let me do, it's actually, I'm not sure I do this with my grad students, I should, but he seemed to just let me go and develop the experiments after that, right? So maybe he didn't want to spend the time, but no, I mean, he gave me an enormous amount of freedom. He got me started on this shock temperature measurements. But then after that was the first year and a half or so, and we got a little paper. And then I kind of drove what I wanted to measure, developed the technique further, right? And what materials I wanted to study and how to study them. So he let me basically, yeah, I mean, from there, I mean, of course, there was always supervision and he could ask questions, but really he gave me an enormous amount of freedom to do what I wanted, right? So
what were some of the ideas in the field at that point, and how was your thesis research responsive to them?
Well, I think again, the mineral physics aspect, it was just, it was at that point, it was just trying to understand. I think we were getting a feel better for what was in the deeper earth, and now it was new techniques were developing also that I was never involved with, but diamond cells, where you could take tiny little pieces to very high pressure and understand the physical properties of the material under squeezed between two diamonds. And so I think it was just at that point still grasping for what are the physical properties of these minerals that might be deeper in the earth. When do they melt, for example, or what might be the speed of seismic waves through them, although those were indirect measurements. And then on the other, the stress measurement was actually pretty active at that point. There was a lot of people working in boreholes and trying to understand earthquakes and how they formed. I mean, and that work has continued and evolved, certainly, but at that point, there was a lot of effort into trying to understand the forces in the earth. And so that's, I think, what led in part to the project I worked on. And there'd been knowledge of some early induced earthquakes in Denver, for example, magnitude 6 type earthquakes in the 60s that were induced by deep injection of fluids. And so people did experiments actually in Colorado, in the middle of nowhere, and were able to induce small earthquakes and understand them. So I think people were grasping at how do you measure the actual forces in the earth then, and we still are, right? It's kind of an unsolved, difficult problem. But it also, there's that understanding earthquakes, but there's also very practical issues. If you drill a borehole, is it going to stay open or is it going to collapse? Things as simple as that, right? And that depends on what the forces are. So that's just one example of what applications could be on a practical side. Oops, did I lose you?
No, I'm here. I'm here.
It said it went unstable. Okay, but yeah, so there was that was kind of the milieu that I think the stress project was within. So
Doug, how much did you rely on synthetic samples for your research, and how much was the result of field research and going out and getting stuff yourself?
Well, in the lab, right, it was all synthetic samples, right? So I did measurements on things like crystalline quartz and fused quartz, glassy quartz, right, and sodium chloride and potassium chloride, things like that. That was all synthetic. But the field work. So I actually did field work with Tom, and we went out to Rifle, Colorado. It's where at the time Union Oil was trying to get oil out of material called oil shale, right? And it's actually probably not even energy efficient, right? You got to mine this stuff out, and then you got to cook it, and you get oil out of it. It's a really dirty process. But so they had a mine. They let us go in, and there was a mine pillar, and this instrument that we made with optical holography, we actually made measurements in it, right? We got good data for sure. And so I went out twice. Actually, Tom went out once to the field. But I wasn't really bringing in samples, right, to work on. I was actually going in, there was a borehole, and you put a specially designed instrument. And so that's probably where I got the sense of, you actually have to go out in the earth and probe it, right, to better understand what's going on. So,
what were some of the principal conclusions of your thesis research?
Okay, well, I guess on the shockwave side, it was measuring melting temperatures of these different minerals up to pressures that would be about 200 kilometers deep in the earth, right? And the sodium chloride, that was more maybe a physics-based one, right? We're studying what temperature does the salt melt at, right? And so because people would need that data to try and understand theoretical models better for melting, which at that time we hadn't had the big computers weren't around. There's been a lot of growth in understanding of those processes since, but at the time people were still grasping using thermodynamic arguments and that to try and understand what's going on. In the stress one, I'm not sure we got data, right? And so I'm not sure we made any fundamental conclusions from that, but we demonstrated the technique could work, right? I kind of went away from it because as I learned, I went and did a postdoc, and that was working on boreholes, and that's where I learned to work on rock properties too, more. But I learned that with Tom, and we all assumed that you drill a borehole and it'll be this perfect cylinder going into the earth. But in reality, what happens is the rocks fail, there's a lot going on. It's actually an extremely difficult environment to work on. And, some of the people who helped me, the technicians, and they were great people, but they'd done easy things like put seismometers on the moon, You just put it out there in a vacuum, right? If you have to put something in a borehole under pressure and temperature, it's a very, very, in something that large, right? It's a very different kind of a situation, right? So it was, I think it was excellent training for me to understand the problems and stresses in the earth and that, but I'm not sure I got much of a conclusion out of it, right? But it did lead me into other aspects of it. So I can't really complain.
When you went to Stanford for your postdoc, was that specifically to pursue new interest in mineral physics?
No, it was the stress. So there was uh, quite a well-known guy named Mark Zoback, and he was brand new professor. He'd been at the USGS for a decade or more, and doing a lot of borehole research on stress measurement in the earth using techniques like hydraulic fracturing. It's just small hydraulic fractures where you just make a crack and you can interpret those curves to understand the forces, right? So I thought, okay, I've had it, by the time you're done your PhD, you've had enough, right? Sometimes. And so I got to find a new method. So I went there because I assumed that this hydraulic fracturing would be the golden key to understanding stress. And of course, it's not either. But that's what drove me. And so I went to Stanford, and that was great. I mean, I learned about borehole geophysics, and there was at the time they had a world leading rock physics lab to understand the physical properties of rocks. As where I said, I torture the rocks in the lab now, and so I learned a lot of the techniques or picked them up there, being exposed to how to make rock property measurements. But yeah, and then that kind of grew when I went to expanded from Alberta. But that's what I got out of Stanford. It was more rock physics, right? That's where, as I said before, from my perspective now, I kind of see myself as a rock physicist who just uses both field and laboratory techniques to understand how rocks behave, right, under different conditions. Yeah.
So how much of a new direction was your postdoc? What was relevant from your time at Caltech? What was totally new to you?
It was, stress measurement was the broad theme, but the techniques were completely new to me. So the hydraulic fracturing, working with pressure systems, all of that, and learning how to carry out measurements in boreholes. And again, they let me do things that I would never let a postdoc do who didn't have the experience, right? But it was different times, right? So there was a borehole on the San Andreas Fault, Cohen Pass. I don't know if you know, on the way up to I-15, right? When you're going up the hill. And there was a borehole drilled there. And so they let me, log with a simple instrument, but, at 7,000 feet depth to run this huge truck all by myself after a day of training. So, you just don't do that today, right? Things were, a lot easier in those days. Yeah. So, let's see. But so, there was those techniques, and then there was the rock properties in the lab techniques. So it was actually quite, complementary, but quite different and a new direction. Yeah.
Doug, tell me about the opportunity that came up at the University of Alberta. First, is it a large program in geophysics?
Yeah, it is. And so it was one of these things. There was a EOS. I'd already had 2 job offers, right, back in Canada and other universities. And then EOS had this ad out from University of Alberta, and I'm from Alberta, my family, right? And so I applied to it, and they flew me up right away and interviewed me. And the job was for an experimental seismologist, which I'd never seen anywhere else before or since. And so, I'm an experimentalist, and I wasn't I told you, I probably wasn't the best at seismology because I never did it, but I learned a lot and applied the techniques I got in at Stanford and built up a lab carrying out, shallow seismic kind of measurements and borehole seismic measurements. and even I've got a seismic vibrator truck, right, that I brought with me to Purdue. So yeah, no, and so again, that's where that gives me the seismology kind of gives me a really nice way to test if I have a borehole in particular, and I can put sensors into that borehole and how the waves go through the earth, right? Then that allows me to study those waves and figure out what's actually happening with the rocks in the real, in where they live, right? And that's what happened at Alberta, right? To move into applied seismology more, yeah. Or I should say active source seismology, because a lot of the projects weren't really applied. They were, different, like Chicxulub crater. I can't say that.
What does that mean, active source seismology?
Well, a vibrator. So at Caltech, no, except Rob Clayton would work with active source. What it means is you use a human source, like dynamite, or this vibrator truck that I have. So I take the vibrator truck and we vibrate the ground a certain way, and then we listen to the vibrations. Passive seismology, what most of the Caltech people would have been doing was just you have seismometers that sit there and listen all the time, and you wait for earthquake waves to come in normally, right? Passively. And whereas active source is you're controlling the source and you control where the sensors are, and then you can use that to image into the earth, right? So it's probably applied geophysics and seismology is one of the big, you never hear about it, but it's actually a huge high-tech industry. It actually consumes a sizable fraction of the Earth's computing power to make these images of the subsurface, right? So primarily for petroleum industry, right? So they know where to drill, right? So so it's through risk reduction, right? There's been billions and billions of dollars spent developing these methods to image into the earth. And what's exciting right now, a little bit, is that those two are starting to merge, and I think they should have a long time ago. But so the sensors that we use now, they're all passive. They sit there, they sit for a month, and but you'll run around with your seismic source and you'll activate it, and then you take the data off, right? And then in the applied field, the concerns about induced seismicity, human-induced seismicity, that's where again you have sensors and you have to listen for the little earthquakes that'll come in, have really taken off in the last decade, right? So these, the more applied community and the more earthquake-based community are actually starting to merge more and more now. So that's kind of an exciting time too, because both had good ideas, but they kind of lived in different silos. And so I think that there'd be a really good cross-fertilization. Yeah.
Doug, I'm curious if the growth in computational power was significant enough that it sticks out in your memory over the course of your research career when it really became a vital tool for your work.
Oh, yeah. I think I'm not a modeler, I do very little modeling, right? But just seeing the capacity to what we can model now, all the way from the minerals to these large imaging of the Earth's subsurface, right? That no, it's just become, you can't live without it. Maybe, but that was already starting, by the time that I became an assistant professor, right? You just couldn't live without a computer, right? So, so it's been around for a long time, but the fact that it's becoming more easily accessible to more and more people, the high-level computational kind of routines, say modeling of wave fields or modeling of stresses in the earth and things like that, where you need just very large kind of computational resources. So I think that's another kind of positive thing. I mean, I need to learn more about that myself. I'm not the best modeler, like I said, right? But but my students certainly, I try to make sure that they know how to use those kinds of advanced computational techniques now, because they can't live without it going forward.
Doug, I asked earlier about sustainability in a contemporary context. In the historical narrative, you were, of course, at the University of Alberta right at the time when climate change and
Right.
sustainability really started to come onto the horizon. Did that affect things in real time for you and your students?
Uh, yeah, well, okay. I'm going to back up to right to that time when I started being an assistant professor. When these 30 years ago, when people started, you heard these first kinds of inklings about CO2 being important, more in a more general way, right? And um, I guess, and so it did, I think, have an increasing amount of influence through my entire career since then, right? And particularly with, like I told, the geological sequestration of carbon. So I've probably been working on that for over 15 years now, to various aspects of it in a lab and in the field. So it started to become important for sure. I guess, so I was in Alberta, and Alberta, of course, is the oil sands or the tar sands, and I did some work there for sure, right? Because it's still a fantastic resource, and we need to get it out. We need to do it properly, right? And what always made me angry a little bit was just the way, the particularly the government in Alberta would hide away a lot of it instead of being transparent when they could have been. If they were transparent about, yeah, we're producing this much pollution or whatever, right? And if they'd been more transparent about that earlier, I don't think Alberta would be seen as the bad boy of the planet, right? But I think that made me angry 20 years ago, just the way things were being handled. And maybe I should have stood up earlier, but I was just I was a professor, right? It was hard to make progress, and this is actually, and maybe it's been on my mind, maybe even before many of the other ones, right, who are in a more pure academic mode, but because I could see what was happening there, and I could see that there was important things that needed to be done, and it's still an incredible resource, and we're going to need it for the next 1,000 years, right? Because we're going to need these hydrocarbons still in one form or another, not to burn them, hopefully, but for other things. And
Doug, like what? When you say other things besides burning, what do you have in mind?
we're going to need them for petrochemicals or stuff like this, right? They're incredible. In fact, some of the early people who looked at the oil, right, I forget who it was, but say in the 1850s, and they said, "Oh, this is too valuable to burn," right? That it's just a very dense kind of chemical organics, and maybe we can reproduce all of it other ways, but I think it's still going to be around and needed in various forms, right? So although we shouldn't be burning it, right? So I think what kind of angered me back in that time frame was just the avoidance, or I think what it is, it's the lack of monitoring, and we see this today still. If you don't monitor something, you don't know about it, and therefore it's not a problem, right? And
Right.
so those kind of things, the lack of transparency probably did more hurt the whole image much more than anything else did, really, because they weren't upfront about things, and that's changed. And now the oil companies actually are probably much further to the left of of the government, right? And okay, now this is, and so to about a month ago, I got and I heard things. You always hear these things. Okay, we're only 1% of the problem. It's not, why should we care, right? We're on producing 1% of the problem here. Why is that a problem? When everybody else is doing this. And I still hear those same exact arguments today. So in Indiana, where I am now, I got this kind of emergency call to come down to the state for a Senate hearing about a month ago. And as you know, Indiana is rather conservative state. And I heard the exact same words coming out of very similar people, just, well, and they were dealing with an issue that had to legally, there's a lot of legal issues dealing with sequestration of carbon underground. Okay. Who owns the pore space? If that makes sense, right? These issues were dealt in other jurisdictions like Alberta and probably Illinois 15 years ago, right? But because they were avoiding all of this issue here in Indiana, what pushed them was that some of the big companies, they want to have hydrogen here to make steel, right? And so if you're going to have hydrogen, we still can't make hydrogen from solar and wind yet. It's just not efficient. So you're going to have to make it from methane that's going to produce CO2. So we got to bury the methane. I mean, the carbon dioxide. And so this is being pushed from industry because they want to, decarbonize as much as they can here in Indiana. And finally, these guys were saying, well, why should we worry about this? Because, just listening to the politicians, the same old thing, the same kind of things. But finally, they voted on, well, it was just a hearing, right? So I don't know how the final vote went. But to allow certain things to move forward so CO2 sequestration could become possible. But that's coming back. They've been ignoring it. They still are, right? Yeah, climate change. I mean, if you're a certain, if you have a certain political view, you almost have to say certain things, which is really unfortunate. But I think it's breaking, right? That enough of the big companies, they know they're going to lose business globally, all of this, right? I mean, and it comes down to money, unfortunately. But I think things have changed, right? And I think there's going to be, that's why I said earlier, I think we're going to see an awful lot of CO2 sequestration and that coming forward. Yeah. So.
Doug, tell me about your tenure as a Canada Research Chair. What responsibilities did that entail?
Okay, well, it gave me a little bit of a reduced teaching load, and it gave me a little bit more resources. So it probably allowed me. So again, I was able to pretty much do what I wanted, right? So the Canadian system is a little freer that way than the U.S. system, in that I think you can direct your own research much more. Whereas here, you've got NSF, you've got to be buddy with everyone. There's a lot more. I think it's actually harder in the States. I hate to say it, to find that more innovative path, because you're kind of somewhat guided by all of these people, say at NSF or whatever, into what they think is the good thing to do, right? Or what's the hot thing to do, right? So there's a real herd mentality sometimes. So no, I was able to do, they gave me some resources that allowed me to, get a pretty good number of students and to test out some weirder things, like some of those fundamental measurements I said of testing, say how waves reflect from Earth materials, right? I would never get funding for that from NSF, right? So and I could never get it from a DOE because it's too basic, right? So I think it allowed me to do some kind of more crazy things, right, and innovative things. Yeah, that was a good thing about that. So
I'm curious because we need China as an energy partner in more ways than one. Yeah. When you worked as a visiting professor there, what did you learn about the Chinese approach to hydrocarbons?
Well, yeah, not really. Well, I'm not really. Well, I guess what I do is I teach a course at China University Petroleum. But I've also been very lucky. I visited a lot of places in China, right, as part of the drilling and that. So that's hard to say because I never really was involved that much with their industry, but with the professors and the students at the schools. What I will say is, and I think this is the whole country, right? And they're putting enormous resources into developing, say, their geophysical technologies and training just large numbers of people, right? So in this field of rock physics that I talk about now, I think there's probably more people in China doing rock physics than the rest of the world combined. Right? And they have the labs and the support, just amazing. Sometimes not all of them know what to do with what they've got, right? Fantastic equipment, and whereas others do, and they're getting better and better. It's just, they're on a real roll to develop their economy. And, there's still 800 million people in China, or 600 million people in China who are still living in abject poverty, right? 400 million that are doing pretty well, right? And so coming more towards our living standards. So they still have a ways to go. So right now, I think they're getting energy from wherever they can get it, whether it be coal or gas or oil, right? So or wind. So I'm teaching a course. Last couple of years has been, aside from COVID, right? I had to teach a new course on energy, and I may try and put a book. I shouldn't say anything, but I'd like to get some kind of textbook out on this, right? It's just it's called on basically fossil fuels, energy, and society is the course I'm teaching, and just to see, how much of the resources are being consumed, by China. That course has given me this opportunity to kind of overview a lot of that. How much coal they're using, how much gas, and all of this, right, to grow their economy. And we're not, we benefited from that in a way, right? I mean, they're producing a lot of the CO2, but then we got, they shipped all this stuff to Walmart, right? So really, we're not guilt-free in that growth and of, say, emissions, but China is really on a move, and what I've seen over the last, I guess I've been going back and, well, I haven't for the last 3 years now, but it's just phenomenal growth. It's just amazing, right? What they've been able to put together in, say, this last 15 years in terms of the cities, and maybe like I was in Chengdu, and they just put in a ring road in a couple of years. Here the lawyers would be arguing for the next decade about, you just can't do that, right, in North America. Or they put in enormous amounts of subway systems, right? That just, New York City, when they finally put in a new line, right? How many decades did that take? Yeah, so they're really on a roll, and somehow we got to get our act together again and try and be more innovative. And I don't know, I think we've rested on our laurels too much, right? Here in North America. Yeah.
Doug, in all your interactions in China, is your sense that most people recognize the connection between climate change and carbon emissions and understand what a strategic threat this is for China and everyone else?
I think that the normal people, the people I interact with, the scientists, they certainly I haven't heard anyone not say that they don't believe it, for example, and they're also taking steps to try and mitigate it, right? So there are big efforts there to look at carbon sequestration, for example, right? So their economies aren't the same place that ours are. So how much effort they'll put into that right away, I don't know. On the other hand, the way they do things, they could be the ones who get in front of us and develop the technologies, and if we're not careful, right? to do a lot of this, right? Same with geothermal. So because they are just putting enormous resources into all these kind of fields. Yeah. So I think they realize it. Yeah. Whether they're politicians or they're businessmen they may realize it but not care. I don't know. I mean, I've been in Beijing when you can barely see the sun, right? Yeah. So it's I think that is pressure from the general populace, because the general populace, they're richer now. And I heard one Chinese person tell me this: we're richer now, and so we want to have a good life and live a long time. Whereas, so people, they've stopped smoking and things like this. So they realize of the health problems. And so I think there is within China pressure to try and clean this up, right? I don't, whether it works in that system or not, I don't know, right?
Doug, it's a very complicated issue, but I wonder if you have a sense in talking to scientists who themselves might have an understanding of the political ramifications, how China understands its role sort of in between the developed world and the developing world in its relation to responsibility to cut carbon emissions. In other words, this is the industrialized world that has created this situation, burning fossil fuels for the past century and a half. Where does China see itself in that narrative in terms of responsibility?
That's a tough one. I don't know that I've actually ever had that discussion with Chinese scientists, right? You have to be careful there what you talk about too, right?
Right.
And especially now, in the last 3 years or so, the mood has changed quite a bit. So I really don't know. I know that they're certainly aware of the problem, but and they see the pollution in front of them quite often. But whether that goes then to saying, well, and China is producing, a sizable fraction of the problem today. But whether that then gets the link that we need to cut back more or not, I really don't know that I could answer that question. Yeah.
Well, Doug, back to North America. Tell me about the circumstances leading you to join the faculty at Purdue.
I don't know. This is a really hard one, right? So I think I'd been at Alberta 29 years, and it seemed
it was a rather late career move.
Yes, yeah. Well, and it was the second time I got called, actually. I don't know. I must have been on some list. Another university had called me, but they didn't give me a chair. And then I don't know. I was just kind of ready. I think I was 29 years, and it seemed like I'd done what I could do, and I'd enjoyed. For example, I taught geophysics field school for over 13 years at Alberta, and then I'd recently come off that, and I was feeling a bit of a void there, So I think I was just ready, and I taught same courses for a long time. So I think it was just, I was in the back of my mind, I might have been starting to think about, well, is it time to retire? And then they call me, and I come down, and then they seem to want me, and so. And we said, well, let's go for it. And I'm not going to say it's been easy, because it's worse than being an assistant professor. New teaching, a new system entirely, right, for funding and that, and so that's been a challenge. Well, I still have responsibilities back in Alberta, but I think it was just, not everybody gets to give it another go, right? And so I think it was mostly that at this late in my career, right, to try. And it's fun because there's a big planetary group here. That was actually developed. And that's maybe part of the reason I'm here, is because a guy named Jay Malosh, who is a famous planetary scientist who had been at Caltech, he'd left as a professor before I got there, knew Tom Aarons really well. And so I think he seemed to really push for me, because I call myself the unconventional energy chair, right? Because I do all these other things, not just hydraulic fracturing and shale, right? So I think he might like those aspects. So I think it was just it was a really nice group. It really felt welcome, and I was just ready for a change. And yeah, we did the jump. Yeah.
Doug, did that present new research opportunities for you, being in a new environment to take on different kinds of projects?
Oh yeah, yeah. So like you said, the planetary people are here, so getting some new collaborations going on that, right? And I'd like to spend more time there, but I'm not sure how much I will. And then making new collaborations with, say, some of the big CO2 projects that hopefully be coming, particularly in Illinois, next door. And then one problem with an issue with Canada is that the level of funding for, say, the scientific drilling, right? It was hard to participate, right, globally like this, and so I think coming to the States would give me, more opportunities to say obtain funding to be part of these international type drilling projects. So yeah, so there were lots of reasons. I still need to get some funding, right? But that's coming, right? You got to get the lay of the land and get into like I said, the network here. It's a little more network based. So that's taking some time, but it'll come. Yeah.
Did you take students with you from Alberta? You started brand new.
Actually, no, I pretty much started brand new, but that's why I say I was carrying I still had 5 students in Alberta, and they completed their PhDs. The last 2 of them, just in December, the last one, and so that was the back and forth, and COVID kind of delayed, set things back because we couldn't travel even to Canada. We couldn't travel very easily, right? And they couldn't come down here to work in the lab. No, they all stayed for a variety of reasons, right? One had a job. There's no mountains in Indiana, and one of them needed mountains, things like this, right? And others were close to the end of their PhD, so yeah.
Well, Doug, now that we've worked right up to the present, for the last part of our talk, a few retrospective questions, and then we'll then looking to the future. First, have you kept in touch with the Seismo Lab over the year? Have you tracked developments there over the years?
Yeah, not as much as I should have. I still have, kind of keep in touch with Rob Clayton here and there, and a few of the others, right? But it gets harder because a lot of the professors that taught me have now, passed on or are certainly in retirement, right? But I also keep in touch with a number of my cohort, right, from grad school. So you kind of get a sense for what's going on there, and you still meet these people at meetings and everything. So, I'm not sure I know exactly who the young professors at Caltech are,
yeah.
Because I've gone a different direction, right? I've gone in so some of them probably say I've gone in the wrong direction, but I don't care. I've had a great time, so, we're doing more applied work and near surface work. No, so I've kind of maybe lost touch with the younger professors, but I try and keep, some tab on what's happening there. But, yeah.
Doug, exactly on that point, because you have switched up your career focus over the years, I wonder what you might have learned at the Seismo Lab in terms of your approach to the science, in terms of collaboration, that might have stayed with you no matter what you went on to do.
Oh, yeah, no. So I think just, Dr. Tom Ahrens was a pretty intense person, right? And I think he gave me, I may not be outwardly intense, but I think just the intensity to focus on a problem and try to get into it, to try and get the physics right, the basics right, I think, and trying to understand it, and then to a lot of the, say, technical skills, I think that you're able to, you don't stop those, you keep developing them as your whole life, right? So I think that's what Caltech basically gave me. The other thing was just a really great group of grad students, right? So when I talked about these projects, the three that you had to do in the very first year, right? And so you did these three different projects with three different professors. So and then you presented those to a committee of some of the professors to see if you should continue in the PhD. But before that, the group of graduate students and postdocs was extremely supportive, right? So before you went to your exam, all of them would come, right? Or a very large number of them would come, and they'd sit down and you'd present what you were going to present to the professors. And then the students would pretend they were the professors and, and give you a hard time and to help you then for that exam. So I think that was just, even though you weren't collaborating directly with each other on a project, say, you were getting a sense that, there was support and how to try and build a supportive community, right? I think that was something I really gained. And, I tried, when you go out in the rest of the world, I tried to build supportive communities like that elsewhere. And it's impossible, a lot of type A academic personalities, right? But at Purdue, there is some of that element again. And that's really nice to come back where we, everybody seems more supportive instead of, trying to have their little, my grad students are here and your grad students are there kind of thing, right? So I think those were, just how to, even though I wasn't successful, but how to possibly build a really, supportive kind of a community. Yeah. And then just the technical aspects that I learned from. Yeah.
And finally, Doug, for you, looking to the future, given all the twists and turns that your research career has taken, what might you take on next that you haven't yet?
Let's see. Well, I think there's going to be, I don't know that I'm going to have huge shifts in what I'm doing. What's exciting to me right now is if we go to hydrogen storage in a big way, how to ensure that that's done safely to contribute to that, right? From more an applied perspective. From the more academic perspective, I've been moving in, we collect seismic data near this Kentland crater. So I've worked on three craters so far. No, 4 craters around the world, right? And it could be, hopefully before I retire, that there'll be a project where we go to Barringer Crater, Meteor Crater in Arizona, and redo a lot of the geophysics there and drill maybe, right? And understand, that's a simple crater, right? And so that would be one kind of offbeat project that would really interest me that I hope I can contribute to, so.
Well, Doug, on that note, it's been great spending this time with you. So glad we were able to get your experiences and perspectives from the Seismo Lab days and everything else. I'd like to thank you so much.
Okay, thanks a lot, Dave.